And we are live. Hello and welcome to Building a Learning Community, Part 1. I'm your moderator, Dame Brigid, and I will be asking these nice gentlemen about their experiences and expertise. The first in this series, we'll take a look at what characteristics an ideally healthy, welcoming, inclusive, and effective practice has, as well as some critical shortcomings to avoid at all costs. This episode is specifically going to focus on what makes a good learning community versus what undermines a good learning community. I will let the gentlemen to introduce themselves, starting with Master Gavin.
All right. So I'm Gavin. I'm currently in the Kingdom of Palantir, which is the Midwest. I am a member of the Order of Defense there. I'm one of their premiers. And so really where I'm going to be talking about is mundanely, I have a PhD in neuroscience, and I do mood disorder and stress. So.
All right, Dante.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dante DiPietro. I'm a Master of the Laurel in historical fencing and a member of the Order of Defense as well. And I am from Atlantia. I live in the Virginia area. The professional expertise that I bring to the table for these discussions is I was a teacher for 11 years, taught advanced placement, language, and composition for a large chunk of those. I've been a curriculum developer and now work as an instructional designer. So I am a lifelong educational professional.
All right, and Valbrand.
Hi, I'm Valbrand Ravensbrücker. I am mundanely, I have a PhD in theoretical physics, specifically how things move and how to learn to make them move. I've been fighting with swords since, well, I guess 1992, so a long time.
Awesome. Well, thank you, gentlemen. Let's start by going into what makes a good learning community. And our first bullet point is welcoming. Welcoming people is what makes a good learning community. Let's start on that.
Okay.
Jump in.
Go for it.
Nobody just jump right in there. So welcoming means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. One of the things that I think is perhaps most important is when somebody who hasn't ever been to practice before, maybe they read about it on the internet or whatever, and they show up at your practice, is there somebody there that greets them and welcomes them and introduces them around and says, hey, this is our practice, this is where we're doing X, this is where we're doing Y, this is where we're doing Z, these are the people, and a good first impression. Some people often think of this as the job of the chatelaine, and that's certainly of course. But I think that, at least for making a good, welcoming fighting community, having somebody there who is there to make sure that everybody is there, everybody who's there is going to get to the right place and get to the right person, is perhaps the most important thing. And we should, as fighters who are building a community, all be that chatelaine that is there to welcome everybody and help them find the right tools to succeed and learn to have as much fun doing this as all of us do.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there with the idea that everyone is a chatelaine to some extent, or everyone, to at least the best of their ability, needs to be a chatelaine. And I think that's an excellent point, that like when someone new shows up, everybody present needs to make some degree of effort with that new person, even if there's one person who's kind of the driving force behind showing them around and whatnot. If somebody new shows up, for at least 5 minutes, everybody's got to drop what they're doing. It doesn't have to be the same 5 minutes, but take that opportunity to focus attention on them and make them feel welcome. And something that I would like to add to that is, when you're meeting a new person like this, I think there's a lot of tendency to kind of see someone and categorize them based on preconceived notions of like, oh, this person's short, this person looks very athletic, this person looks less athletic, etc. And then make assumptions about them. Everybody's a unique individual person, and it's important to treat that new person not as a cookie cutter representative of different aspects of them, but look at them as a real individual and be respectful of that, so that you can engage with them in a genuine and authentic conversation, because people can tell when you're going through the motions, and they can tell when you're not treating them the way that they would want to be treated very quickly and very immediately, and it's a huge turnoff for people. So just even if for example, I'll use myself as an example, because I'm on the shorter side. If somebody talked to me as if, and I was also, when I got into SCA fencing, I was also kind of on the chunkier side of things, having been in college and not doing anything for a long time. If somebody had just looked at me and gone by, my general appearance, they might not have, put as much energy into me or talk to me differently. But I was also coming in with, an athletic background and so forth that wouldn't have been readily apparent at the time. So it's important to treat people as people, I suppose, is my point there.
Master Gavin.
So I think there's a level of what was just suggested. I think, to be clear, is that there is a active and purposeful somebody going to welcome this person, right? And sort of the thought that I have had about that idea is that there is a point where your practice can be too large to make that effective. So I think you have a newcomer showing up and there's 70 people at a practice can make it very hard to figure out who that person might be, or to even notice a newcomer. And I think that's sort of a pitfall to think about. Other kinds of limitations you guys see that might make this more difficult.
So I have a wonderful example of that. So the practice in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is the barony of Alboran, that practice is on Sundays is a combined heavy and rapier practice in a huge park. And I have seen that practice pull 70, 80, 90 fighters, right? Just on the heavy side, not counting the rapier side. And so one of the things that the barony of Alboran has done very well is they have a shadow lane tent that they set up, and they have, the Baron and Baroness have their pavilion out there, and they have these notable points of welcoming and welcome and contact, so that whenever somebody is new, just walking by, because this is a big public park, they're very visible. There's always somebody there ready to engage with anybody who comes by and asks what's going on. And that's a really good example of how even very, very big practices can help and do that. But it does take coordinated effort from the entire community.
One thing I'd like to add here is kind of a welcoming on a level of inclusivity. It is important, obviously, to encourage and greet everyone who comes in, but it's also a lot more welcoming for people who are especially minorities. If they see more people who look like them, more people who are their demographic. As a female fighter, it's easy for me to come into a practice, and if I wasn't already well established in SCA fencing, I'd say, hey, are these just a bunch of guys? Or is this just a bunch of whatever? And so part of that building community goes beyond just your practice. It also goes into helping them see that there are other people like them out there, and that they do have a community network to build on.
That's an excellent point. Thank you for mentioning that. Absolutely. Gavin and I, in recent weeks and months, have talked about some of the other kinds of tangential things to that, like having, if you've got loaner gear, have a size 3 mask in the loaner gear for a smaller person. Have a 5 if for a much larger person, if they even make such a thing at this point. Glove size, loaner gear for gloves. Not all the swords necessarily should be 45-inch blades that weigh 3.5 pounds. You need stuff that accommodates a wide selection of body types. I can't use just my old armor as loaner armor, for example, because if somebody doesn't weigh 200 plus pounds, they're going to swim in it, and it's not going to be comfortable. And if they're not comfortable physically, they're not going to feel like it's for them.
Yeah, at both the Penzic Maestro of Defense meet and greet, Lady Rapier meet and greet, and also on our podcast, we've talked about one of the lowest hanging fruits is a lot of women are tiny. We have smaller frames. And so an easy low hanging fruit is just to have a smaller set of armor in your baronial armor kit.
And I'm going to add, make sure that it's clean and washed.
Yes.
My first practice ever, I showed up and put the loaner gear on, and the hood smelled terrible. And so I showed up at my second practice with my own hood.
See, that sounds like a means of attaining greater investment.
And they all looked at me funny and thought, well, why did you show up with that specific item is what you came up with first, right? And that was why.
That's a really good reason.
Yeah.
All right.
There's one more thing I want to talk about with respect to welcoming, if I can.
Sure.
So having a welcoming practice and building a welcoming community is more than just practice. It's going out for dinner afterwards. It's building that network of friendship across all the different people that you practice with, all the people that are there. You have to build those relationships and have that basis of the friendship that we all have amongst the folks who've done this. We all get to know each other, we all get to be friends, we all get to hang out and eat food and laugh and have fun, not just in the act, in the meat and potatoes time of practice. And that, I think, is actually really, really important.
And don't go to Hooters.
No. Wow.
That was one of the pieces of feedback we got on the Maestro of Defense group, was they were like, yeah, I went to my first couple of practices and the after diner was Hooters, and I was like,
there wasn't a Fridays nearby or something,
right?
Come on, guys.
Like, I remember, there was, the thing was you finish up practice and then everybody heads to Denny's and we take over the place. And yeah, Denny's is not the best food in the world, but it's got all the things that are sort of welcoming and inclusive. It's cheap, it's good enough, and it has something pretty much for everyone, right? You can hit.
You get a milkshake if you want.
It's silly, but you can hit pretty much any demographic from vegan to carnivore in a Denny's. And so, you can accommodate almost any dietary restriction, and you can get everybody in a room to, share a meal and laugh and have fun. Well, back in times when we could get together in a room.
All right. Well, we have, I'm going to slide along to the next one because we've got a lot of things to cover. The second bullet point, what makes a good learning community is safety. Who wants that one?
I'd like to start off on this one because this is something that I encountered a lot just in my career as a teacher, like because your classroom has to feel safe for kids in a number of different ways. We all remember high school and all the different things that go on with that. And the classroom has to feel like a place that's okay to be. So one of the things that I think is of critical importance early on is to establish that it's basically to establish that not doing well at first is an okay thing. If someone is nervous, or if they haven't done something like this before or what have you, and they don't have that understanding of it's okay for me to be bad at this for a while as I gradually improve. If you don't have that experience previously and haven't internalized that for whatever reason, this can be incredibly daunting. There's a lot of complexity, and it takes a long time to become really adept at it. So a good learning community is one where it's understood that failure is a critical part of the learning process, and that it's a critical part of the joy of learning. There's a really good book by Ralph Koster called a Theory of Fun. And I really recommend it if you're an ARMIC at all and plan like melee scenarios and whatnot. But he was one of the creators of Ultima Online, and he defines fun in this book as learning in a safe environment. And that's most essentially what games do, is they allow you to fail at something and then try again and fail and try again and fail and try again and gradually improve. And those are the games that we play. We play games that allow us to fail productively and safely. And if you can make your practice such that, if you're doing drills, getting hits not a big deal. If you're the new person, and you slip and slide around, and stumble because you're not used to moving, to make it okay to have those issues, to make it normal and natural and for everyone, and not to be a big deal. People are much more willing to open up, and they're much more willing to engage with stuff if they don't feel like they're going to be harshly penalized every time they get it wrong.
At the same time, there's a fine line between making sure that we help them stay safe. And so slipping and sliding and falling around may just be, you need to get a better pair of shoes. Or, something like that. And maybe they're not period shoes. Maybe it's, go to Goodwill and get a pair of sneakers for practice, and then we'll figure out your footwear later.
All of my examples are embarrassing memories that I have.
Well, I'm sure.
I was well treated early on, but nonetheless, embarrassing stories.
Master Gavin, you look like you wanted to say something.
To add to the physical safety aspect, I think it's also worth talking about, we're doing a fighting activity, and in any fighting activity, there's a notion of consent to how far things are going, and when does it stop? What do you use? So I think for example, it's very important to explain what hold means very early on, because let's say your new fighter gets in a position they're very uncomfortable, right? I mean, if they were in MMA or other like grappling, they tap out, and that's the understood stop. But being able to say hold is important for them to be able to crap, something weird happened. and bail, and have that be respected. But also with, if they don't want to go spar right away, you don't need to make them, and probably shouldn't, but that's more about, productive teaching. But when we get to like bigger wars, this plays out in our melees where one kingdom is thinking they're playing a melee game one way, and another kingdom thinks they are a different way. And the rules could be interpreted both ways. And when person A does something that person B thinks isn't okay by the rules they're used to, then there's a flip out. But that's just the exact same thing can happen for your new fighters now that they're, geared up and going. So it's very important to talk about that aspect, I think, from a safety perspective.
I think it's interesting that you bring up the big wars, because quite oftentimes we have people who are really just fighting in these big war points because it's part of their kingdom culture and because they're trying to support their kingdom. And this goes well beyond a learning community, but we have a really big problem with these wars where we have people who don't regularly practice, who may have just authorized the week before war and grabbed a two-hander that they're going to throw out there like a pool cue. And a lot of problems that end up on the field is actually a very large result of our inability to manage safety at a large scale within our society. Valbrand?
So in terms of safety, one of the most important things is your teachers. And a good practice discourages bad teachers. They train new teachers, and perhaps most importantly, they protect the students so that the students are going to get quality instruction in a very, that's what I'm looking for here, a very positive environment. So one of the things that I think that makes a good teacher is somebody who can allow you to fail and provide positive, deliberate, I don't want to use the word criticism, I want to use the word encouragement to improve the skills, right? To be encouraging as opposed to critical. And that's one of the things that helps to create a very welcoming community where you're going to be encouraged to succeed instead of criticized for failing.
Yeah,
Oh, go on, Dante.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's very true. One of the pitfalls that people fall into very frequently when they're trying to give instruction is they tell people what not to do. Don't do this, don't do that. But that doesn't provide direction. It cuts one off, but it doesn't tell people what to do instead. So one of the things that can be very helpful with creating that sort of positive expectation is to give people clear feedback on what it is that they need to do and make it something that is very clear and actionable that they can take. Like, for example, I just came across this very recently in an article, and I thought it made a really good point about giving feedback to people and how to make it in such a way that they can take action on it and be comfortable receiving it. And the difference that this article made was the delineation between feedback and advice. And advice is a giant problem because most people just give and receive advice, And advice isn't really very helpful because it sort of tells you what to do, but it doesn't really. And here's an example of what I'm talking about with this. If I say to you, you should be more aggressive, or take the initiative, or lunge when you see an opening, I'm giving you advice, but I'm not really telling you what that means in a practical, actionable sense. So I'm telling you what to do, but it doesn't give you, that clear set of instructions. Whereas if you tell someone, as feedback, hey, the way you're standing allows me to hit you in the face unopposed. What can we do about that? Now you're talking about something that's much more concrete and much more actionable, and that person will change their guard, hopefully, and not get hit in the face so much. And so now they've got immediate positive feedback and that incremental improvement of, hey, my teacher told me to do this, I did it, and now things are working better for me. Whereas that nebulous advice, even if well-intentioned, of, be more aggressive or what have you, a lot of the times, if someone doesn't have the skill set in place to be more aggressive effectively, they're just going to get hit more, and then they get frustrated, and it becomes a downward spiral pretty quickly.
The be more aggressive is on my pet peeve list of phrases that bad teachers use that put students in actual physical danger. To go back to what Valbrand was talking about a few minutes ago, because if they can't act on that, they get pezzed in the face repeatedly while running.
And that's not a very safe environment, right?
No.
That's not making them safe. And giving them a safe space to fail.
Dante's mentioning of advice is one of my pet peeves about being anecdotal. And I could not possibly say it any better than Baz Luhrmann in his To the Class of 1999, Wear Sunscreen. And if you've never found this, Google it after we're done and go watch it. But he says, advice is a form of nostalgia. Dispensing it is a way of fishing the past from the disposal, wiping it off, painting over the ugly parts, and recycling it for more than it's worth. I love that quote. One of the things I wanted to mention is that, especially in the context of SCA fighting, our teaching process at your local practice is entirely geared towards ensuring that we get people authorized to fight. And the authorization process, I think, is something that we don't touch on enough in terms of safety and making sure someone's actually ready. A lot of times, authorizing marshals will just look at someone and say, well, we need to get them on the field today, and so let's hand wave them through the process. Oh, they don't know the questions? Oh, we'll give them answers to the rules questions as we go along. They're hitting too hard. Okay, just tell them not to hit so hard and sign their card. This is a point where it's our responsibility in the community to be a gatekeeper for safety and a gatekeeper for training. And when we see someone who is not ready, who is not safe, who is not showing a remarkable ability to learn why they are not getting past their authorization, we need to make sure that they don't get past and help them, encourage them. This shouldn't be a stigma. If you don't pass your authorization in your first go, it should actually be something that's more of a normal thing, that we say, hey, these are the things you need to work on at your local practice, and please try again, in a few weeks or something like that. I know when I started fighting, and I'm not going to take up too much time because I'm the moderator, but when I started fighting, I probably should not have been authorized. And it took 45 minutes to do my dagger authorization because I was so afraid of hitting someone and getting hit and getting that close. And the people involved were just determined to make sure, oh, no, it's okay. You're going to authorize today. And I just wasn't ready. I was such a new fighter. I was terrified of the situation. And that should not be someone that you should authorize. That should be someone who needs a little bit more time with their local group, instead of pushing them to authorize real quick. Oh, hey, you've done a little bit of Dagger this week. Let's get you authorized. No. So,
No, that's an
are there,
excellent point.
thank you. Are there any more comments on safety before we move on to the next point?
Yeah.
Got one.
Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. And this is peripherally related to discouraging people that can't teach from teaching until they learn how to. But if you've got people at your practice that are a problem for some reason, either they refuse to be safe, they're creepy and don't act right around people. I am of the opinion, and it's difficult to manage this, but I'm of the opinion that like those people need to be dealt with in one degree or another. And it may be as simple as, hey, the thing you're doing is creeping out these other people. Stop. If you have to be that direct, be that direct. And if that's not enough to get the behavior to change, then those people need to be dealt with according to whatever sort of procedure is in place to deal with people that don't have good behavior. Because if you let somebody run amok who's not acting right, you're enabling it, and anybody coming to the practice sees that sort of behavior is allowed. And if that's not comfortable for them, and it shouldn't be, they're not going to stick around. And you're going to lose however many new people there were at the expense of trying to keep someone included who is causing the problems.
Oh, go on.
That's it.
Oh, I was going to say it's often even the case that fight practices don't occur at the same place as baronial business meetings or other meetings of groups. So the rest of the barony may not be aware that the person running the practice is creepy or is a problem. Making sure that you loop in the baron and baroness or the local seneschal may be a good next step if this person is unwilling to change. Giving people a good toolbox to deal with a local problem is important.
Yeah, so basically I wanted to chime in with pretty much what Dante said, but to make a point that it is the responsibility of the community as a whole to create the environment where those people are, if you are going to behave badly, you are not welcome. And we have a set of standards for behavior. We have a set of core values, and we need to make sure as a community that everybody in that community is living up to those values. And the only way to do that is to help your friends be better people, right?
Master Gavin, do you have anything to add before I move to the next?
I was going to say, we've actually, I think, almost exclusively focused on physical safety and haven't talked much about like emotional safety in this section on safety. So if we're going to move on from safety, maybe we should address that first. But some of these things are kind of both. So if you're setting up and you have someone that's creepy or whatever, you're creating an emotionally unsafe environment that is emotionally unsafe because it has the potential to be physically unsafe. And then it's unwelcoming. But Dante mentioned at the very beginning of the section, students need to be able to feel safe to fail, and that's part of it too. Now, when we're talking, say, missing stairs as people, like you can do everything else we're going to talk about today, and if you have one of those, like you're going to be losing out just because they are essentially need to be dealt with first. But the other thing that makes them tricky is one of the defining characteristics of predators is that they purposefully negotiate some people to be their defenders. And so it really, in the SCA context, has to come down to the actual officers to be willing to say, enforce policies like, you don't get to go talk to the new person. That's something that doesn't require the BOD, but it does require, say, a seneschal to say, these are the boundaries that you're allowed to perform and participate here at this event or this practice. Like, there is more leeway that the seneschal's office has to do things like that than we like to talk about, because it's uncomfortable. But as the marshal or as the seneschal or as a peer, you need to look up what those predatory behaviors are and watch out for them. Not just, well, I didn't see him cross this line, because there's a lot of nudging that line that isn't enough to get them kicked out that we have to be careful about too.
For those who may be watching this and are unfamiliar with the term missing stare, I would encourage you to Google missing stare and read up on it, because it's a really profound way to explain something that is actually really complicated. Okay, so very good points, Gavin. Thank you. I'm going to move now on to what makes a good, effective learning community.
I can start off with this one as well. So effective learning has been pretty much well understood in terms of how people learn things best. There are the whole idea of learning styles and so forth has been very thoroughly debunked. They're not real. Don't take my word for it. Look it up if if you're skeptical. But they're not real. What it turns out is that everybody needs a mix of things. You can't just read about something. You can't just see it. You can't just do it. You have to have a mix of things. But what's of critical importance is that the student is presented with a skill that's modeled for them. It is slightly beyond their current ability. So they try it, they struggle with it, they fail, they receive correction, and then they struggle with it until they succeed. And if you go through that process, you get incremental improvement, you get something that's emotionally satisfying for the student because they couldn't do it at first and now they can. And those things are also very deeply ingrained as memories for them because they had to spend so much time, puzzling through it, and invested in it. So that process is really foundational. It's absolutely critical. And if you're not going through that process with someone, there's a lot of wasted time at best.
So I guess one of the things that is important here is that you should have deliberate, purposeful practice, right? You should have a plan. There should always be a plan for practice. Now, if you are the student, you shouldn't be the one coming up with the plan.
No.
If you are the student and you are coming up with the plan for your instruction, that is straight up a recipe for failure. So,
yeah, and not the good kind.
Yeah, and not the kind of failure that Dante is talking about. That is, you're just going to be, in a place where you are going to be frustrated, and you are going to plateau and you're going to dead end, right? Because you don't have the skills necessary to plan how to give you deliberate, purposeful practice.
Yeah, and that won't even happen for quite a while to be able to plan your own learning. And I like that you use the terms deliberate and purposeful because in Anders Ericsson's book Peak, he summarizes about 30 years of research in skill development and how humans develop develop capabilities and things. And he identifies 3 types of practice. So deliberate is the best type, and that's when you have an expert teacher who is guiding your every step along the way. That's the most effective. That's the one that works the fastest and gets the most results most quickly. Purposeful is when you don't have a teacher, but you're using the types of methodologies that a teacher would use. For example, I'll use myself as an example. I'm mostly the result of purposeful practice because I took fencing manuals. I took fencing manuals and no one told me what they meant. I read them, I tried stuff, I figured it out, one piece at a time, and I was very methodical with how I approached those things. And and so I went at it in a way where I was trying to kind of uncover what was present. And going at things that way, where you're, after the event on the car ride home, you've got friends with you in the car, you're talking about, what happened, you're working through stuff, you're figuring out, okay, I got hit this way 5 times. How do I make those adjustments? What do I need to do next? What would stop that? That's all in that purposeful range where, you're trying to figure things out, but it can take a long time. You can spend 4 or 5 months on purposeful practice to get the benefit of 15 minutes of deliberate practice. But that third kind, naive practice, is what we mostly see in the SCA, and it's bad.
We'll talk about that under the undermining.
Yeah, I'll go into it a little bit more, but naive practice is basically practicing without a plan, and it doesn't work, period. And there's all sorts of, I'll get into that, later when we get to that point. But yeah, naive practice is planless and it doesn't work.
I think I'd like to present a counterpoint to Valbrand. Obviously, I do think that if you have a plan and you're the student, you shouldn't be the one making the overall plan. But at the same time, I believe if you come back from an event and you're like, wow, I had this weird opening on my forearm that kept happening, going back to your teacher and saying, hey, I think this is something I need to work on and I don't know how to fix it, right? I think there does need to be a lot of communication, both from the teacher and from the recipient. The student needs to want to learn. They need to want to advance their skill set. And so by doing that, that communication has to be a two-way street.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. In the sense that the teacher-student relationship should be collaborative and safe. And, the student should feel safe enough to come and say, hey, I'm having this problem with my lunge, or I'm having this problem with, that guy over there, or I'm having this problem with, that gal, or I'm having this problem with, I just keep getting hit in the face by this one person, right? How, and be able to feel safe enough to ask those questions is very important in building the nature of a practice.
Well, I think those are 2 different topics there. Feeling safe emotionally with your teacher is definitely one, but the collaboration, I believe, is part of effectiveness.
There's overlap.
Yeah, there's overlap. Gavin.
Some of the weirdness here is sort of thinking about what level your students are at. So in an ideal world, we get a new person, we train them to some level of skill that is some bar where we can actually say, communicate and have that kind of discussion with them. But our culture in the SCA is that point would be about where we maybe give someone an AOA if they're really practicing, perhaps, but we have a guy show up on Thursday, we put a sword in his hand, and on Saturday we sent him out for an authorization that we told him to read the rules in the car ride, and now they're going to go fight. So when they're asking questions like, well, I kept getting hit by this shot, instead of providing a structured learning program, it becomes very ad hoc when oh, I kept getting hit in the arm like this way. And it's like, yeah, because you haven't even learned how to hold a sword correctly yet. And so a lot of the questions that come up in the way that we do things in the SCA are a very ad hoc consequence of not training to some baseline of principled learning, and rather just sort of guess and checking our ways to creating a hole. Well, then we patch the hole, and now there's a hole somewhere else, and that's yeah, it's very complicated.
I think some of that comes back to, and I think this, I think Brigid's peeve about authorizations, I think really creates a lot of this problem. Imagine if, in order to authorize, a person had to demonstrate and pick a system, pick a non-system, pick a non-historical one, something. Just pick an anything. Imagine if they had to demonstrate that they could take a guard, that they could get in, maintain the stance, that they could move, that they could lunge correctly, and there are right ways to do that. And I'll rant about that more with naive practice. That they could parry and riposte, the way that should all be done, and that every single person that had an authorization card all had a identical or nearly identical set of underlying skills and assumptions that we could make about what a person had learned prior to stepping onto the field to be able to do everything at a war. Whereas instead, what we currently have is mostly, no matter how poorly you execute a move, were you able to just not hit super hard?
Mm-hmm.
And that creates a very different kind of environment where you're essentially telling everyone, hey, in order to do this, what is expected of you is almost nothing. You have almost no expectations on you. And so later on, when we try to rein someone in who now, has maybe started to punch with their sword and hurt people, there's no expectation that the behavior changes, that the action changes. We just tell them don't hit so hard, which gets back into advice versus feedback. We say don't hit so hard, but we're not willing to tell them that there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things, when there is a right way or a few ways that are right, and everything that's not those ways is a problem and needs to not happen.
So I'd like to piggyback on Dante's answer here and say authorization should be a case of minimum skill set. I like that idea. Here's the real problem that nobody wants to talk about. We do not authorize teachers in the SCA. There is no authorization that says this person can teach. This person can teach this skill. Anybody who wants to can get up and stand up and go teach. And while that's both good, it's also bad, because
mostly just bad.
I mean, it's good because there are very well qualified people who, we might not a priori know their qualifications.
Sure.
Right? Who would like to get up and teach something and teach it well, right? They can currently do so, but so can Joe Blow, who is just going to do more harm to his students than good, but he's charismatic and people like him, so people show
We all
up
know that guy.
and they learn terrible habits and and can end up being, taking significantly longer to unlearn the crap than it would have taken to teach them the right way in the first place.
I want to tag in here briefly, hopefully briefly. One, piggybacking on your original point, Dante, about authorizations, and one of the things we look for is they don't have to be good; they have to be safe, which is it's just the nature of it. Would it be nice to require them to be somewhat good? I think that would be a very pleasant fiction.
I
I
would make the. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were.
Oh, it's okay. I also think that in terms of authorizations and authorizing someone who later down the road is a problem, I also have no problem with us saying, hey, your authorization suspended for the next 3 months. You need to work on this. Go back to your practice until your local marshal says this is, you're clear, and we'll check back in 3 months and make sure, you're good to go. But I think we should do that more often. I think we
Yeah.
should not be gun shy about suspending authorizations of people who are problems and who are regularly, like, yes, an accident happens. Like, yeah, I might hit someone too hard or something like that. Once is an oops. More than once is a pattern. And when you start to get a pattern, we as a community need our safety officials and the officials who are enabled within our kingdoms and society to ensure our safety for all. We need to take a stronger stance on that. It's not going to happen, and that's my pleasant fiction. Did you want to rebut to that? Because I also have something I wanted to comment with Valbrand.
Oh, just one really quick thing. Really quick. I would make the case that safe and sufficiently skilled are synonymous. And I don't think that I personally have difficulty considering someone to be a safe fighter if they don't have those certain very specific fundamentals in place, like the ability to lunge or perform an attack in a way that is correct, because if you don't extend your arm before you step, you're risking your own face getting hit on the way in, but you also increase the likelihood of you delivering a lot more force to the other person. And then if you're both stepping in, one of you just got punched in the face with a sword tip. So I don't think it has to be a very high bar, but I think that safety and basic skills are synonymous in a very important way.
We said the same thing, but I think you clarified it better.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm glad we're in accordance.
Yeah. And then Valbrand, I did want to rebut on the thing you said, and then I'm gonna swing to Gavin for more. But you said that maybe we should authorize teachers, and that also is a really pleasant fiction that I would love if we were able to do that. As the marshal in charge of a small barony in northern Kentucky, Cincinnati is the biggest metropolis we had in that region, and we have 3 baronies that are technically in Kentucky. And when I was the local rapier marshal, and the person, myself and the warder I was connected to originally, we were the only rapier marshals in that area. And so if those baronies wanted to host a practice, we would need to go down for a special thing. If they wanted rapier at their event, we actually were their marshals for their groups. So when I started saying, hey guys, I'd like to help my students learn from more than just me, and I'm not very good at teaching historical fighting. And so I would read a chapter of Degrassi, write a book report, send my book report off to people to grade for me, and then I would teach that book report. One time an illustration was problematic because it was from the later version of Degrassi. Long story short, I got blasted by the group of teachers, which was centralized in Chicago at the time, for not teaching well enough. And the whole ridiculousness of it was the illustration had nothing to do with what I was doing. It's just the pretty picture I put on the cover of the book report. However, what this evolved into was me saying, well, come down and teach, because we don't have anyone. Like, there is literally no one down here able to do better than I'm doing. And I can only do so much, right? And so they said, well, send them to the Kingdom Academy of the Rapier. I'm like, that's great. We don't have enough scholarships to get everyone up there. Like, people are, you know, not wealthy, and getting them to go all the way over to Chicago for a weekend was pretty impossible. And so I ended up actually hosting the Known World Academy of the Rapier in Cincinnati as a result of the fact that I was so frustrated that I couldn't get teachers. We were in a teaching desert. I couldn't get teachers to come teach, that I put in a bid to society to get teachers to come. Like, that was my level of desperation of, hey, we need more people who know how to teach to come show everyone what it looks like to teach, right? And that was just such an amazing event to host in an area where, you know, they were thirsty for teachers in that point in time. It's no longer the case, and I'm glad for that, but I'm certain there are other areas of the known world where there are teaching deserts. And so instead of saying, you know, these people are bad teachers, I think we need to focus on how to help them learn to teach and encourage that. That's my soapbox from my own anecdotal, frustrated past.
I totally agree with you, and there's a plan for that.
Okay,
So
Dante.
yeah, I would just add that I actually have a website that solves all that, and has a like a teaching certification, so to speak, where if you fill it out and send me your answers and stuff, I'll go through it, you know, check over everything, give you feedback. You can resubmit stuff if you want to improve. And it also has like probably 40 or now 50, because I'm starting to add teaching methodology links to it. Just a whole list of resources of articles to read, you know, books to look at, you know, channels that have good videos, all these different resources and things. So if there's anybody out there in that sort of situation who's like, I'm the instructor here and I'm overwhelmed and I don't feel equipped, you know, it's it's a blog spot. It's the DiPietro School of Defense. There's a test there, and it's a syllabus. It's a guide that tells you, you know, what do you need to learn.
Where would we find this?
It's the I don't have the exact URL memorized off the top of my head, but
if
it's
I were to Google keywords.
DiPietro School of Defense would do the trick.
Okay.
Yeah, that would do the trick.
How much engagement do you have with people doing your test or your certification?
Well, so I've got maybe 4 or 5 people right now that are working through it. Oh, good. Gavin just sent the link out.
Okay.
Yeah. So
that would be HTTP. Sorry, I can't read it. It's on my other monitor. We'll put that in the YouTube comments when you.
Yeah,
post
I'll put it in there.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Master Gavin, though, has been waning very.
Yeah, it's his turn.
So.
I'll stop.
Yeah. So something you said now a couple comments back about suspending people's, you know, authorization for 3 months, sending them to their local marshal, and then like reauthorizing them. I think is actually very tied to what you were then trying to rebut Valbrand about the practical realities of where marshals are and teachers are. But I would say all of that's actually a trap that's created by the way we do things.
It's a what? You broke up there. I'm sorry.
It's a trap, right? So, someone starts hitting too hard. So we authorize people with no skill, no actual skills. If you punch people with a sword, as long as you do it gently enough, most of the time, you can authorize. And as long as you mostly punch people gently with your sword forever, you maybe will eventually get a 3-month suspension where we give you the advice, not feedback, to stop hitting people too hard, and then send you to the marshal that trains you not to know how to hit correctly with your sword in the first place. And then we test you 3 months later on the test that allowed you to get away with having no skill to start with, right? So that is all arbitrary and meaningless. But the kind of problem that your other comments were about how there aren't teachers in places, that there's no one to teach a lot of the SCA, I think are a consequence explicitly of not having real standards. So if we're not training skills overall, we're not using skills as our guideline for, say, authorization, then we're not valuing skills. So we're not ensuring that every fighter and every marshal has those skills. So how can they teach them? So, I mean, we've created a cycle of no skill because we argue, well, we don't have skill in large swaths of area, therefore, how can we ever expect people to meet these standards? But we don't have them in those areas because we don't have the standards.
Okay. Well, are there any final words on what makes a good learning community before I move on to what undermines a learning community? Because I feel like we're starting to drift into that space.
I would agree.
Okay. Well, then we're going to move on to the second segment of this show, what undermines a learning community? And the first bullet point is fear. Fear is the mind killer.
So yes, I guess that's me. So very basic neuroscience is that our mind is made up of interconnected systems. There is a fear system. It's really an emotional system. There is the part we do our thinking with, that's up here. We think about being smart humans that plan and think. And we have a separate system that really is in control of planning and creating motions, right? So fencing is a movement activity, and that's also a really important thing. And these sort of three systems are interconnected and they turn each other off. So what we want to be doing is training in a way that allows our movement system to learn how to move correctly, and our brain thinking system, planning system, to learn to identify scenarios and situations and learn that way. And if we get someone anxious or afraid or even excited, those parts of the brain are immediately turned off. You cannot learn while anxious. You can learn fear learning. So ideally, we want to build a system where people are not trying to be emotional at all while they're learning, so they can access those parts of the brain. The big bad downside to if we're letting people be emotionally active is all of the learning of our movement system takes thousands and thousands and thousands of repetitions, right? You guys got to guess for how many times you need to learn a fear response? One time, and that's it. So if you create a scenario where you scare a new fighter, unlearning that is extraordinarily difficult, and they're probably just going to not come back. So that's your first start there. And so being welcoming is certainly part of it, making certain there aren't, giant Confederate flags at the Nathan Bedford Forrest Gymnasium that you're practicing in is going to be part of that. Making certain that there's not some creepy person trying to touch them inappropriately is part of not letting people be afraid. But that's only the beginning. We also have to build practices and activities that are safe fighting. Obviously, wearing our masks and such and our gear is important. And to really avoid going into this for 10 hours, I highly recommend you still have it handy. There's a book called Fear is the Mind Killer that came out pretty recently that I really dives into this. So she's showing that on screen.
Fear of the Mind Killer by Katja, I'm not going to say her last name because I will probably butcher it, but Sadowski, I think. This is the book.
Right.
I actually picked it up because it was recommended by Maestra Sorsha of the East. My bookmark in here is Nancy Pelosi standing up to a room full of men.
But yeah, that's the sort of the basis that we have to start from is that if you are letting people get emotional or amped up, they can't learn anymore.
And this may be a way more complicated answer than I expect, but what would be a method for people to start to learn how to overcome that fear? If I mean, we can all have the best of intentions, but we could inadvertently cause someone to have fear, which is going to very dramatically interfere with their practice. What would be a good starting point to help someone who is feeling that problem and needs to get past that hump?
Well, I mean, so obviously if it's because an unsafe environment has been created, you have to fix that environment to begin with. The sort of general way that you learn and unlearn things is repetition. So if, I don't know, someone has a flinch response when someone lifts their sword to Alta to deliver a mandrito because someone crushed them with the shot that's incoming, right? You have to back off and then work back up to creating that situation in a safe and clear, scenario. So you might masks off and no swords even, just have someone that they trust just start going into the hand position, and then maybe you add a sword at a distance, and maybe, so, but it's very hard to unlearn those kinds of things.
One of the reasons I asked that is because personally and anecdotally, when I started fighting, if someone came at me with a sword, I would do this. I was afraid to hit people. I was afraid to be hit. I would blink. I would close my eyes if a shot would come in. And later examining this, a lot of that came in from the idea that I was constantly reinforced and told by my mother, women don't do martial arts, when I would beg her to let me do martial arts. And so I had this preconceived notion, this terrible fear that I can't do this and that it's going to hurt me, or I'm going to hurt someone. And I was very terrified to start fighting, to be honest. And it took a lot for me to get over that.
I think that's a more common response than a lot of people in the SCA understand, because those people leave. They frequently don't show up to practice number one, but they certainly don't show up to practice number two. And part of the, building a deliberate training, it is generally a bad thing to just shove someone in a mask at their first practice and have them go spar. But working with someone that, say, is a little afraid to hit, we start by just teaching them to hold the weapon and to perform a lunge. And then maybe we have them lunge against a target. And then we maybe have them lunge against my finger. Then we put on a mask and have them lunge against me while I hold no weapon. Like, that is how you would build a progression that avoids that problem ultimately, because by the time you are having to hit someone and be struck in a fight with all of that context, well, you've already poked someone, even moving around, you've, gotten hit in a very controlled environment where you can avoid a lot of other emotional stuff going on, because it's very additive. All the emotional anxieties add together. So you limit that, and then you train people to build up to that sort of thing. I mean, that's what we're talking about today.
Can I interject here, Gavin?
Oh yeah, go for it.
Go for it, Belbren. Can you speak up and speak a little slower? Because there's
Yes.
a little lag that's causing your words to not match the mouth on the screen.
I see. So one thing that's, I think, is something that undermines the community is teachers that don't recognize that fear response and mitigate it. So many times we're all happy to, just throw somebody out there and say, go to town. And we see teachers just ignore that fear response and just say, oh, you'll get used to it. Instead of providing, a healthy way to learn the skill in a fear-free environment. And as teachers, that's the fundamental responsibility, is to make sure that your students aren't afraid of what you're teaching them.
I think piggybacking on that in an inclusive manner, we also, typically more women than men end up having had histories with domestic disputes or domestic violence, and trying to overcome the idea that they're going to get hit is very hard. And so, yeah, send back to Gavin.
Well,
Oh, you're done?
I think, yeah.
I'm in.
I think
Put me in, coach.
All right, Dante, you're up.
Okay, so a lot of this ties into the notion of what naive practice is that I mentioned earlier. And
That's
naive practice,
point.
naive practice is like I had a plan. Naive practice is essentially, you show up, you spar, you go home. Naive practice is basically a waste of time. There's not a meaningful difference between going to naive practice 52 times in a year and going to naive practice like 0 times in a year. There's but that's essentially it, because what happens with naive practice, and we all practice certain things naively, if you're not trying to get skilled at something, naive practice is fine. But it has severe limitations on it. And part of the problem with naive practice is, one, from a skill perspective, you max out at advanced beginner. And those of us who are more skilled fencers will understand this immediately. But there are some people who, once you figure out how to defeat them, they go from being difficult fights to being incredibly easy because they lose in the same way every time. And they're not capable of making adjustments. And that's a byproduct of naive practice, because what happens as a result of naive practice is all of your actions become automatic, even your mistakes. So you go through a script of motions that you are not really capable of deviating from. And once someone solves that script, you are solved forever.
Master Dante,
Yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you here because I want for the people who may be watching this video to understand your terminology. Can you please explain briefly what advanced beginner means, and in the context of other things with advanced beginner?
Sure. That's in the context of the Dreyfus model for skill acquisition. There's novice, advanced beginner, competent, proficient, and expert. Just very briefly, a novice is shows up, there's somebody who doesn't really have any skills in place yet. An advanced beginner is someone who has started to form rules around their actions. And in any large group performing a similar skill, novices and advanced beginners are going to make up about 60% of the population. Competent are the people who are able to improve themselves through guess and check, but without having a clear necessary methodology. And that's about 30% of the overall population. Proficient would be people who know what their goals are, but don't necessarily know how to get there right away, and they have to spend time figuring out how to arrive at their goals. That's about 8%. And that last 2% are the experts, and those are people that are completely intuitive, able to, basically an expert is someone who can make a guess about something and be correct because they're just a giant pattern matching machine, and they've seen things so many times that they understand, instead of like, I got hit in the forearm, what do? It's, I got hit in the forearm, that's because, and they can go off with a list of reasons why a thing happened and make the appropriate adjustments, prioritize correctly, and so on. So naive practice, and this is from Peak, naive practice hits a ceiling at advanced beginner. And what Erickson found over the course of 30 years of research, so he's one of the leading people in the world on this, he found that naive practice of the three was the only one where you actually got worse at the thing over time. So not only does naive practice not help you get better beyond a certain point, a low point, you actually will drop off over time as your habits become increasingly ingrained. It gets harder and harder to improve those habits over the long haul. And that's mostly what we do to people. We take them, we put them in an environment where they're not being told what to do. So so it gets back to that, oh, I got hit in the hand a lot. Okay, well, let's go spar and I'll keep hitting you in the hand until you fix it. Like, that's not helpful. And even if they do figure out how to not get hit in the hand, that's an excruciating process. And it may not even come up with a good solution. It may just come up with one that happens to work at that moment and maybe presents all these other vulnerabilities.
I was totally guilty of that. My first student, that is exactly what I did. And Luciano, I'm really, really sorry. Please forgive me.
A lot of us did that sort of thing at some point or another because we just didn't know any better.
Because we didn't know any better.
Yeah.
And,
but now you've got someone in a situation where they're going to practice. They've plateaued early because advanced beginner is a low level. They plateau early. They keep going to practice. They don't get any better. They get frustrated. And then we load that frustration by telling them that, if you're feeling frustrated, you just need to change your attitude because this is supposed to be fun, which is one of the most gaslighting things that we say in the SCA, where we tell people essentially that if they're not enjoying themselves, that they've got a bad attitude, when the reason they're not enjoying themselves is because we're not providing them with any of the tools that they require to have a positive experience. And so not having those plans in place, not having everybody on board at a practice to want to improve, to want to learn, really undermines the potential for people to have a good experience and to enjoy themselves. Because unlike other things, if you and your friend both want to just go play tennis and just whack the ball back and forth and be terrible, like, that's okay. I've enjoyed playing pool. I'm not good at pool. But I have played pool with people who are good at pool, and neither of us enjoy it. Because they just run the table and I just watch them run the table. And what we repeatedly create is a situation where you have the person who is very casual in their experience, who maybe doesn't even know how to hold the pool cue correctly, integrated into competitive situations with the people who are doing consistent trick shooting.
Yeah. That's a good analogy, and there's a funny side note that's totally unrelated. Valbrand is currently sitting at our pool table. Neither one of us is that great at pool, but we both love playing it. So.
Well, so I guess the thing that I wanted to say, Dante, is probably the best example of how we don't do that is, by and large, at least in my experience going to practices and watching new people come to practices, the people who show up at practice and want to learn how to fence don't know how to be an athlete. And we don't teach them that, right? We say, okay, we're going to teach you how to fence, but you don't know how to be an athlete. And Gavin will tell you, that's a whole separate set of skills, which is completely different from learn how to fence. And I think that a lot of times we undermine the learning community by not teaching that, by not encouraging people to develop the skills of an athlete. right? Everybody here, right, in this discussion, we all know you hydrate, you warm up, you stretch, you progress, you do slow work, you have this thing that you do so that you can go and you can then go out and perform at a high level.
And you do some of it away from practice too.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
And
Yep.
you know what those people that show up, they don't know, and we don't tell them often, far too often, that 80-90% of the work that is done to make us good fencers is outside of our practice.
Can I piggyback on that real quick? And then I think Gavin made a face and has a comment. One of the things about being an athlete, yes, is the upfront training, but the other thing we don't talk about as much is injuries. And are you injured or are you hurt? And a lot of times we're just like, oh, it's okay, shake it off, work through the pain, or, do this or that. We end up with a lot of people with tennis elbow because we don't teach people how to strengthen those tendons and those muscles, and muscles really, but how to protect those bits that make your arm and fingers move. I have chronic injuries because nobody actually told me up front what training needed to happen. And so as a professional, in the mindset of an actual athlete, when you are hurt, find a physical therapist, figure out how to actually fix this thing, and not just put some KT tape on it and hope it's going to be okay. There's a whole industry based on this, and it's not for nothing.
Indeed. But even to your point, there's one thing that question of, are you hurt or are you injured, is a skill that athletes learn.
Yes.
Right? The ability to tell that difference. And we ask people, how would they have a basis for knowing?
Gavin.
Yeah, so one of the things Dante said just a few sentences ago, talking about overcoming challenges versus not having the tools to do so, right, from naive practices, kind of to tie back to the broad theme of undermining the learning community, and to throw some neuroscience in there. When people talk about stress, they usually mean their lives are busy, etc. In neuroscience research, we have a couple different kinds of stress, and the differences matter. And
the differences what?
Matter. Those differences between the kinds of stress engage different brain systems and have very different experiential outcomes. And so stress of being challenged by something, when you have the tools and skills to do something about it, right? So we talked about advice being bad and feedback good, is because that doesn't tap this circuit.
Puppy.
Is that what?
Puppy.
Oh yes, Shadow is guest starring. So that circuit of being able to be challenged and then overcome it with your skills is actually something that is very rewarding in our brain, right? So if you're all have heard about dopamine being important, that causes a dopamine release, and it's like crack. And when you're trying to build your training, what you're trying to do is string people along by challenging them with something hard that they can overcome with the skills you've taught them, and then give them that dopamine reward. And I don't have a great easy book, but I think there's a book about how MMOs design games to hook people, based on World of Warcraft and stuff. And I don't know the title of it.
The Theory
I think there's one that goes into that.
That's
exactly that theory. What?
Is it The Theory of Fun by Koster, the guy who did Ultima Online?
He doesn't go into that too much.
Oh, okay.
This was really a discussion of the reward systems in the game and why they pose a challenge but then give you something every 30 seconds, because it needs to be timely too, right? If you go a long time without your dopamine boost, you get bored and you leave, which is hard to navigate as an instructor. But the bad kinds of stress are really bad, and what those are forms of stress that you're challenged by something and nothing you can do, you have no tools to solve the problem, will matter and change the outcome. So some of the very common things that people have phobias of, like claustrophobia or being buried alive, are triggering that stress response. Because if you're buried alive or you're stuck in a tight space, nothing you can do fixes the situation. And this creates a very this hits a very destructive pathway. And when we say give people advice they can't act on, when we put them in a fight where they don't have the tools to win and then they lose, it doesn't matter what they did in the fight. If Johnny Newby fights Dante, there's nothing they can do to win. And whatever they do in the fight isn't having an effect on that outcome. And that triggers the bad stress. And when we see people getting grumpy on like our online communities in fencing, it's frequently sort of new to intermediate fencers who are just being given advice, not feedback or instruction, trying to go get their GOA. Why am I not a white scarf? Why aren't I a mod? And they're being told things like, you just got to win more. And that creates the same bad stress. And that bad stress, incidentally, being one of the things I research because it creates psychosis and depression and mood disorders. But that's kind of the key. You have to give your students tools so they can overcome challenges. But if you're setting them up with challenges they can't affect, then you're dissolving their mind.
You mean that in a literal sense, don't you?
Yes.
That's now an image I'm not getting out of my brain. Coming back to Dante, did you have any follow-ups on naive practice since we all interrupted you?
Oh no, I think at that point, when we, once we establish that naive practice, meaning just the show up and spar and don't have a plan and not practice without looking to an expert. Now that we've established that it has a low ceiling, that ceiling drops over time, and that based on Gavin's description, it can create a situation that, I think the best word to describe it would be torturous. Hopefully that's all the nails in that particular coffin that are needed.
Okay.
So one other thing, can I say one more thing?
Yes.
So to Dante's point, right, that he brought up earlier with respect to the Dreyfus model, approximately 2% of the people practicing any given skill are experts. So if you just do the math, right, because people don't like to do math, if you have 100 authorized fighters in your kingdom, statistically 2 of them are experts. You should probably know who they are. 200, you got 4. 300, you got 6. 400, you got 8, right? So when we talk about, access to an expert to instruct you, that's what I think we're sort of conflating the definition of expert, in the sense that you don't necessarily need an expert, and Dante's going to correct me here. You just need somebody who has significant skill gap and the tools to be able to productively guide you, right?
Oh.
Am I on the right path there? Because the thing we're trying to talk about here is that when you're looking for a teacher, you don't necessarily need to go and find one of those 2, 4, 6, 8 people. Right?
No, that's ideal, but obviously not always feasible. The real thing, I think, and this is somewhat my own experience, somewhat just my judgment based on everything that I've read about these different related topics, which is fairly extensive at this point. But people can sort of train someone else up to the level of skill below them to a reasonable degree. So if you're an advanced beginner, you can probably get someone reasonably through novice, but maybe not also to advanced beginner on your own, unless you just you just grind at it enough, and then you'll both be advanced beginners forever. Someone who is competent in the can guess and check effectively stage of things could probably lead a practice that had like a work type thing where like, oh, let's all talk about what just happened and try to figure stuff out, and let's look at this fencing manual and try things out, and and work through. um, they may not be able to get anybody further than that, but they can get people to at least that range of things. And it's and then once you get to kind of the proficient stage of things, there's a certain point where like a lot of the things that used to work for learning purposes stop working. Like a proficiency is about when doing things like keeping a fighting journal, for example, ceases to have any utility. So it's you don't need to just deal with the experts, but you should defer to them and be aware, if you are not an expert, what your limitations are when dealing with other people. I think Brigid's example earlier of, hey, this is what I've got, please help me out. That 2% that are experts, that other 8% that are proficient, those, if you probably know who those people are for your area, and some of them are going to be willing to, reach out to you. And I would make the case that anybody who's, a peer or in a leadership role, if they're not doing that, if they're not willing to do it, they're screwing that up pretty significantly.
I would say, bringing this back into the practical aspect of like someone who's watching this saying, well, crap, what can I do? Right? What can I do if my local marshal and I are also just advanced, beginners or competent or whatever? I believe there's a good point by which you realize you're hitting a plateau. I can only keep winning this way. I only have this shot that works. I can only counterpunch, and I'm winning only if I do this. Things that are a hallmark of you're stuck.
Yeah.
A lot of kingdoms host academies of the rapier or collegiums or other teaching events. And also the Known World Academy of the Rapier is a really good resource when it comes into your regional area. These are obviously cost prohibitive because you have a lot of travel. Sometimes you have hotel incursions, things like that. I would encourage you, if cost or other things are a problem, maybe float it to your local group. Say, hey, can the 4 of us carpool? I also might even look to your barony and say, hey, this is really important to me. I'm the local marshal. I don't know how to teach very well. I would like to go to K-War. Is there any budget or any ability for the barony to give me a scholarship, or some help to go to this thing so I can ask people, so I can learn more? A lot of the problems are, we can say all you want, we don't have good teachers, but we need to find ways to solve that. And in the Middle Kingdom, for a while there, the Bronze Ring was doing a scholarship to get people to the academy. And so they would basically front the cost for 3 to 4 people who couldn't afford it. You could apply to say, hey, I want to go, but I'm a college kid. I can't afford that cost. And they would find ways to pay for you to get there, just so you could get that learning with those experts that you may just not have access to locally. So I would look into your resources within your groups and your kingdom.
Another thing that I would suggest, is do the stupidest possible thing, which is to just ask them to come teach you.
Yes. Can you come to my group?
Just ask. The worst they could do is say no, or say, hey, can you throw gas money at me? Right? But to Dante's point, these people are peers. These people, this is their job to help foster and grow this community. And, just ask.
Even ask not peers, like Baron Valbrand here. is a really great teacher if you'd ask him to teach you.
Yeah, and yeah, most people I think have a good sense of who the knowledgeable people are in their areas, and most of those people are just like, champing at the bit, waiting to dump knowledge on someone. I think it's more likely that if you ask one of those people to teach you stuff, I think it's more likely that you're going to get more information than you can process all at once than not enough. I always have to ask people if they're full.
Yes, that's a good question.
That's one of the thing about experts is, if you ask them to talk about the thing that they have expertise on.
Poof, yes. My question I ask people is, what happened during this fight? How did you win? How did you lose? And they're like, I don't know, I got hit in the face. And I'm like, okay, what led up to that event? Another way I help people, just bringing this to practicality, I say, watch the fights that are happening. Why did that person lose? What did that person do to win? And it can be a good teaching tool while people are just sitting around waiting for their turn to go fight.
Failure mode regression.
Yes. Okay, so the next thing on our list is XYZ isms and demographics. Dante, you made this list.
Okay. So this gets back to what I was talking about earlier with seeing people as individuals. It's so this is a teaching, classroom management environment sort of 101 type stuff. But one of the things that I think is really important to realize that can undermine a learning community is if you treat everyone the same, it's not good because everyone's different. But if you also treat everyone as if they are a collection of their demographics, it's also not good because that's also dehumanizing. It's, for example, I might say, okay, teachers generally know that that the students that are born later in the year tend to struggle more because they're younger than everyone else. The December babies, so to speak. Because if school year starts on January 1st, somebody born on January 1st is 364 days ahead of somebody born in late December.
Oh my
And
God, that's a thing? I thought that was just me.
That's a real thing.
I was almost a New Year's baby, and I would literally, like, as a young child, do smart ass things because I was bored. Like, I would erase holes in the paper where the answer is, and I'm like, I had the right answer there. That's not my problem. It's not there anymore. Like,
yeah, it's a well-known phenomenon in the teaching community.
I had no idea.
Yeah, it's but the thing is, like, even if that's a general trend, you don't want to go into it from the perspective of, oh, you were born in December, you're going to misbehave, because maybe it's not true for that person. And nobody wants to go in, nobody's going to feel comfortable going into a situation where they're told by someone else, oh, you're this, you're that, so now I understand you because I read an article about how this type of person is. Everybody's an individual, and it's important to understand those demographics and understand the different aspects of them and the different challenges that they may face. But it's more important and to also then be able to recognize that trends for large groups of people may not apply to the individual person whatsoever. And if you have people at your practice, it's just critical to recognize that maybe the tall young male is also the one that has, problems being hit, and that there's no guarantee that just because someone fits into a particular type of trend, that's their reality.
Master Gavin?
I mean, just to add to that, there are also frequently broad claims that may relate to a demographic that don't necessarily even make sense for what we're trying to teach. People can latch on to because maybe there is a difference, but it's not, strictly speaking, important for, say, fencing. That's another way that you can end up making a mess of your learning community. You're trying to emphasize things that aren't important, that are demographic differences, when it's irrelevant. I think, for example, there are gender differences in the stress response between men and women in general, but we just talked about why you shouldn't be triggering that system at all. So if you're trying to teach women to amp up their stress response faster before the fight, you're actually creating a situation where they can't learn.
That's a really good point.
So some of these are red herrings too, that people have to be careful about.
Indeed. I would like to say something about that. Statistics are not anecdotes, and anecdotes are not statistics. Right? That's something that every
Say it
scientist.
louder for the people in the back.
But this one time, Val.
Huh?
But this
At this one time, yes. But but that being the case, to your point about statistics influencing demographics, and if you take your demographics from your statistics, you can get into trouble. So the average fencer is well over 6 foot, right?
I don't know. I'm 5 foot. Everyone's a giant to me.
And so the net result is that female fighters, which are statistically shorter than male fighters, are even more disadvantaged by a system that favors tall fighters. And while it is true that Dante, who is not as tall a fighter, suffers that same thing, if we look at it and say, well, women have to deal with things because they're shorter, we're missing the bloody point, right? And so...
Right. How do we train shorter fighters to be better?
Right. Instead of how do we train women differently than men? Right.
Well, there are differences in training of women.
There are.
Like
there are
physical
differences, and there are all sorts of things. As you haven't just talked, the brain is wired differently, right?
Also, ligaments are like differently, like how we rest with our fist, like how our elbow will superimpose out if we lock our arm. Mm-hmm. We teach that in archery. We don't teach that in fencing, right? Why? And fencers know that. And why? Because all the girls are going to get smacked right here with the bowstring. So we teach women, if you are a woman and your arm does this thing, you need to hold your arm at an angle, whereas men can actually lock their arm out.
And I was going to add to Valbrand's point, the idea of effect size is important. Mm-hmm. So this is how big.
The idea of a what was important? I'm sorry.
Effect size.
Effect size.
Things can be different, not very different at all. So you just gave the example of the elbow, and the studies say that there is a 3-degree difference on average, right? Does 3 degrees matter for fencing? It seems to matter for archery, but it doesn't necessarily matter for fencing. But if we look at, say, height curves between men and women, like there are almost no women in the world as tall as I am. It's a very large defined gap.
How tall are you?
I'm 5'11". So there's something like 1% of the women in the world are my height or taller, right? And I am essentially within a standard deviation of the average male height. So full 30, 40% of men are taller than me and 1% of women, right? Those are very different curves. And that can play into how much of a thing, if you're not prioritizing or thinking, through your lessons, you also have to ask whether the differences are big, whether it's just a difference that exists in the science literature. And it may not be relevant to the activity you're doing, or the differences may just have a huge amount of overlap. And so you read one study one time that says men and women have different elbow angles, and it's true, but there's a lot of overlap there.
What is the p-value?
Well, that's not effect size. That's,
Anecdotally, the p-value is.
but that's also worth considering, is whether, the difference that is measured in a scientific study is really that different at all for some demographic or not.
But again, this goes to the point of hey, science is science, and you need to read the science in the context of science and understand it. In the is this statistically significant? Is this a large effect? How have you established those things? And that's again, the difference between competent and expert, right?
And this is all. I think like we might be getting into a little bit of overwhelming detail here, but I want to acknowledge that this is not an easy request that we're making here of people. The easiest thing to do is to show up, fight, go home. That has consequences. It has predictable outcomes that are known and understood, and you don't necessarily need to understand the statistics behind particular things. I certainly don't understand the physics or the neuroscience behind the teaching techniques that I may use, but it really comes back to if you're trying to create a positive environment where people can make progress, where people can learn, and where people can feel good about what they're doing, there is an effort level involved. And it doesn't have to be flawless. If it's good enough to make people feel good about showing up, to make them want to keep coming back, to make them make progress over time. It doesn't have to be perfect. All of us can come up with different examples of times where we drop the ball on those things, and that's okay. The difference is if you are trying to carry the ball and move the ball forward versus if you have dropped the ball and left it, if you have refused to pick up the ball despite being told that the ball is there for you, or if you are refusing to acknowledge that the ball exists at all. It doesn't have to be perfect. Part of what will make you develop those teaching skills is a willingness to do the same things that you should be doing with your students, which is to challenge yourself, to struggle, to fail, to improve, to succeed and move forward. Because I will tell you, with great certainty that very few things are more satisfying than being able to produce success in your students consistently, reliably, and rapidly.
All right.
So,
Well,
mic drop.
sure, Valbrun.
I just want to ask a question, because we sort of skirted around this quite a bit without actually indicating any ways to accomplish this. And maybe we want to postpone this for another edition. But my question is the following. How do we make it part of the culture of a practice to encourage students to want to improve, as opposed to encourage students to show up and fight.
I think the fascinating thing is that that's what people think they're doing. They think by having them show up, maybe do 5 minutes of drills and then everyone plays, they're encouraging people to become better. And I don't think that's necessarily the best way, as Dante pointed out, to get good. Go on, Dante.
So humorously, the notes that we've started preparing for our second episode on fixed versus a growth mindset will deal extensively with the answers to that very question of how do you cultivate that growth mindset? You know, how do you get people to
I didn't read ahead.
to feel like they can learn? How do they get people to to be able to learn and be successful?
All right. Well, we are almost hitting the 2 hour mark, which is where I'd like to stop off. We do have one last bullet point, but I do believe if we go more than 2 hours, like, we're going to lose people.
That's fine.
So my last point is the last bullet point you had was not everyone on board. Would you like to talk on that briefly?
Yeah, very briefly. If there are people at the practice that are not willing to participate in a constructive and positive way, that does a lot of damage. If everybody is warming up and somebody isn't, that's a problem. If it's time to to do a group drill or something, that, and somebody doesn't want to do that and makes a big fuss about it, that's a problem. That person is harming everyone else by detracting from their experience. So it's an important thing that if you're going to have a good practice with a good learning community, that everybody get on board for it, or at the very least, you figure out some way to adequately sequester different needs so that they're being met. Because if some people just want to do naive practice, and you can't really talk them out of it and you can't stop them, at the very least they need to not do it where they're going to be disruptive for the people that are trying to be more purposeful or deliberate. That's all.
I think a fascinating or easy way for that to happen is, I recently had some criticisms from a friend, and I took those criticisms to heart and I've thought about it. And she said, hey, I've been teaching classes and you didn't show up, and I could have really used your backing. Like, if you had my back, if you were showed up, then maybe other people would have shown up. And I was like, oh, you're right. And I could have done more to support you by simply going to your class, going to your drills, doing this thing. Even if it's not something I'm personally going to get anything out of, just my presence and encouraging other people to come and do this thing is making that slightly more enabling and supportive as a culture.
In a practical sense, to sort of answer the question Val asked moments ago, some of this is new people to your practice, don't know what to expect, and will do what you expect of them. So if everyone's drilling, everyone will drill, and the new people won't know any better. It's the people who have been around for it not having that shape that are going to be the hard sells. And exactly the idea of you have to convince them that they want to role model the correct behavior.
I would like to hope that most of the people we've elevated as leaders in the community would want to do that. I know that's not the case. It's a pleasant fiction. Valbrand.
That's all I've got.
Okay. Any closing remarks before we call this a good episode?
I think I'm set.
All right. Well, we would like to, Valbrand.
Oh no, I said I think I'm good.
Gavin. All right. First off, I want to thank the panelists who have come and developed this class for building a learning community. I believe, as Dante has pointed out, we have more episodes lined up. Not sure how many, but we'll figure that out. And thank you very much for coming and watching this video. We hope we've enabled you to identify the characteristics of a positive learning community and how to avoid terrible pitfalls. Until next time, thank you.